Welcome, friends, to a gathering place for the curious and the brave. Do you ever feel a shiver run down your spine on a perfectly ordinary day? Does the rustle of leaves in the wind sometimes whisper secrets in your ear? We delve into the realm of the unexplained. These are true stories, whispered through generations, passed down from campfire to campfire, each one abrush with the unseen. So settle in, adjust the lights, and prepare to be chilled. Tonight, we share true scary stories. I had just gotten home from work and was sitting back on the couch with a movie on. It was storming outside and it was Friday, so what better to do than stay up late and watch some TV? I had the window curtains open in case any lightning started up. I was hoping to catch some cool sights outside. It doesn't really rain very often where I live, so nights like these are really rare, and they always get me so excited. As the night went on, just at about midnight, I noticed something strange outside my window, just down the street. There was a man walking down the sidewalk. He had no hood or coat on and was completely soaked. He walked up to one of the houses and onto their porch. I couldn't see too much through the rain. It was quite dark as well. It looked like he was waiting for them to answer the door, though. After about a minute, he walked down the sidewalk again and continued further down the street. I couldn't see any further from where I was, but seeing this man's actions gave me an uneasy feeling. At this time of night and in this kind of inclement weather, it just wasn't normal to be walking around and up to people's houses. I closed the curtains by the window, just so that if he came to my house later, he wouldn't see me inside. Only about 15 minutes passed by before there was a sound outside my house. I could hear someone walking up my driveway and right up to my front door. There was no knock or doorbell ring, though. I heard them moving around, walking across my porch and then back down to one of the windows, then going back to the door. By now, I was really confused. I wanted to look out the peephole, but I was worried they'd somehow notice my presence. I waited, and after a minute there were no more sounds. I quietly walked up to the door and looked out. It was the man I'd seen earlier. He was just standing there, completely still at the edge of my porch, looking at my door with a blank expression. I watched him for a few seconds before I got really creeped out and backed away. It was now that I started to think that calling the police might be worth it, especially if he was going around to other people's houses and doing the same thing. I turned to get my phone, but just as I did so, I heard the sound of footsteps departing. I looked out again. The man was gone. After giving it some further thought, I still felt this was just too creepy to not inform the police. Whatever this man was doing, it was something that was not normal. I called them and let them know about it. They said they would send an officer out to patrol the neighborhood and see if they could get the man to stop or explain what he was doing. That was about all that could be done at the time, though. I thanked them and hung up. I checked out the door one more time before going out to the couch. The whole thing had really worn me out. It was taking away the relaxing part of my relaxing night and just making me exhausted. I shut everything off and went downstairs to get in bed. As soon as I got in and turned off the lights, a loud thump sounded from downstairs. I sat up, and the sound came again. It was loud, like someone smashing something against the wall. I got up and ran to the top of the stairs. Now hearing it for the third time, I realized it was the front door. Someone was bashing something against it, like they were trying to forcefully break it down. I walked down a few steps and peeked over, seeing the door violently shaking every time they hit it. It looked like they were just a few hits away from breaking it down. Now absolutely terrified, I locked myself in the bedroom and called the police again. The operator said that an officer was in the neighborhood and would be here in just a minute. Through the sound of their voice, though, I heard the wood shattering and the door slamming against the ground. Footsteps quickly moved throughout the downstairs, going into every room without stopping. They began moving up the stairs, but were cut off from their advance by the officer pulling in and running up to the house. The intruder immediately turned around and ran for the back door. As the officer came in, he yelled at him to get down. Apparently, they had trouble getting the back door open. The officer was able to rush him and get him down into the car. The man looked like a psycho up close and refused to say anything, not even a single word. His intentions were clear, though. He was carrying a heavy hammer and had a bunch of zip ties in his pocket. And that doesn't exactly sound like a coincidence. Considering what he was doing, why did he choose to go for my house? That isn't clear, though what likely saved me was calling the police that first time. If I hadn't, the officer wouldn't have already been in the neighborhood and so close by. He likely would have gotten there far too late to save me, or for me to have ever been seen alive again. This happened last year. It was the beginning of spring, and we were going through a rainy month, where pretty much every day there was some kind of downpour, either light drizzling or full-on storms. I do deliveries for a popular restaurant in my area, so rain isn't the most amazing thing when I have to be running through it all the time to pick up and drop off orders. This night started as any other. I got to work at 6 and drove around a couple of orders before getting one to deliver to a somewhat far away area. It was about 10 miles out from our restaurant, going into the more woodsy part of town. It wasn't all forest or anything like that. It was just more spread out and less densely populated. The roads were all covered by trees, and most neighborhoods weren't visible from the main roads while driving through. On my way there was only one car behind me, which was not weird in any way. That's just how empty the road was. Once I got maybe 2 miles in, though, the beam of someone's headlights in front of me came out of nowhere, revealing a car right in the middle of the road. Swerving to stop, I slammed on my brakes. The car was sideways, blocking the whole road. The guy behind me did the same, stopping so close to me that I was surprised we didn't collide. After the initial moments of shock, I looked up at the car in the middle of the road. It was a beat-up-looking sedan, and they had their brights on, making it too blinding to see who was in the car. I'd say that whoever was in there had to have been falling asleep at the wheel or something, maybe just not paying attention. Well, I would have said that, but they seemed to have intentionally left their headlights off until the very last moment, when they turned to block the road. I didn't see where they'd come from. It was too dark, and I wasn't sure if they'd been driving down the road or if they'd come out from a side road. The car behind me laid on their horn, clearly frustrated by whatever this was. I probably should have been more skeptical, but in the moment when something crazy like this happens, it's hard to think straight. Either way, the car behind me was too close for me to move back, and the car in front of me was blocking the whole way forward. I couldn't do anything unless one of them moved. After a while of the guy honking behind me, he stopped and got out of his car. I looked in the mirror and saw a large man begin walking through the rain. He looked completely furious. He passed right by my car and walked up to the other one. He stood at their window angrily yelling at whoever was in there, but with the rain I could barely hear what he was saying. I couldn't hear anything of what the other person was saying either, if they were even responding. I saw the man outside bang on the window a few times as he yelled and yelled, but then suddenly he stopped altogether and went completely quiet. He slowly backed away from the window, then nervously walked back to his car. As he was getting in the driver's side, the other car door opened and a man stepped out, wearing a thick hoodie that covered most of his face. I was now getting really freaked out. I still had no way of leaving at all, other than running my car out into the woods, which was probably a horrible idea. I sat there and watched as the man quickly made his way up to the car behind me. Just as he got to the door, the car floored it backwards and their tires screeched as they slid against the pavement. They lost control and slid off the side of the road. They made it past a few trees before slamming into one further into the woods. The man that was still on the road turned and looked at my car, making eye contact with me in my side mirror. I put my car in reverse and pressed on the gas, backing out past him. I then turned around and sped off. I obviously called the police, but I still had no idea what was going on there that night. An officer got to the scene about 15 minutes after I'd left. The only thing they found there was the car wedged in the woods against a tree. The other car was long gone, and neither of the men could be found. I think we can all assume what probably happened without even having any reasoning to go off of, but there are still a million questions that need answers. All I can say is that if the other guy behind me wasn't there, I would likely be in whatever place he's in right now. This happened in January of 2020, when I was 18. Over winter break, I had signed up for DoorDash, since a couple of my friends were also doing it. I didn't really need the money, as I was in high school and still living with my parents, but it was more to just have something to do. As a kid, a couple $100 a week was pretty damn nice. The first few nights went smoothly. I got the hang of it after the first 3 or 4 orders, and after that it was all just the same sort of work cycle. During my second week, I started working more, getting excited about making money for the first time. I tried to make as much as I could. My friends were doing the same. They had mentioned that on days with bad weather, you'd usually make even more. On the one night when the snow started coming down, I chose to hit the road and do some deliveries. For the first hour, I was FaceTiming one of my friends as we were both driving around. He stopped and went home around 8 though. It was a Saturday, so I could stay out as late as I wanted. By 10 o'clock, I was getting a little bored. I took up one more order, I got the bag, and drove to the neighborhood. This was just some regular street with very average houses. By now, the snow had covered up everything though, which made it both hard to drive and hard to see the numbers on the buildings. I slowly made my way down the street until finally finding the right address. It was a 2-story, very typical-looking suburban home. It even still had Christmas lights hanging on the trees outside. I parked and put my hazards on, then got out. I double-checked the bag had everything and walked up the driveway. As I approached the front porch, though, I saw the front door was open. Not all the way, but just enough for it to be considered strange, considering it was snowing and so cold. I figured it was so I could leave the bag inside the house, rather than out in the snow. When I got up to the door, I pushed it a little bit more open and slid the bag inside. Just as I pulled my phone out to take a picture for confirmation, I heard a woman's voice yell from across the house. She asked if I was the delivery person, dropping off her order. It sounded like a young woman, maybe even in her early 20s. Yeah, I put it right here in your doorway. I was not expecting any conversation. The woman responded right away. She asked if I could push the door open and bring the bag inside to her. I knew it was strange to be asking me to go in their house, but I pushed the door open just to see where they were. Past the entrance, there was this long hallway that led to what I assumed to be the kitchen. On the wall, I could see the clear shadow of the woman, who was presumably standing around the end of the corner. Where do you want me to bring it?" There was a long moment before the woman responded. She leaned half of her body around the corner and showed herself at the end of the hallway.
She urged me to bring it on over to her and gestured with her hands for me to come inside. Then she slipped back around the corner and out of sight. I realized that the shadow outline on the wall had not moved with her. It was someone else's shadow, standing somewhere by her around the corner. I stood there for a second as I felt blood rush through my body. I quietly placed the bag down and took a few steps back before turning and rushing away from the house. I stumbled into my car and glanced back at the home. As I pulled away, in the front window, the figure of a large man approached and watched my car as I left. I stopped at a nearby gas station to catch my breath and rethink everything that just happened. It was pretty clear by how everything played out that this was some kind of a trap. I also knew the police would have nothing but my word to go off of. I did end up reporting it, but when they went to the house to ask the woman about what happened, she denied that anyone else was there. They denied the officers access to search the home for anyone else too. Like I said, the police were unable to do anything at the time. What the woman and the man were trying to do by getting me inside their house is unknown. I can only imagine they would have robbed me at the least, and at the worst I wouldn't be here right now. This happened March of last year. I was living in a really cheap apartment complex. It was all I could afford at the time. The apartment was tiny and my neighbors were a lot older than me. The vibe of the building was very much single dudes. One night in March at around 2 a.m., I was lying on my bed reading a book. I have a habit of staying up late. All of a sudden, I heard a loud banging sound at the door. Someone was trying my door handle as well. It sounded like someone was trying to kick the door in. I could hear it shaking with the impact. I thought it was someone annoyed and making some sort of complaint about noise, but I hadn't made a single sound in the last 2 hours. I didn't have the TV on and I wasn't playing music either. I'm not ashamed to say I was absolutely bricking it at this point. It was really frightening. I managed to muster up enough courage to creep over to the door and put my eye to the peephole. I saw a guy out there I had never seen before. He looked to be about 50 years old and had this totally insane look on his face. I didn't understand why this guy was so pissed off. I hadn't ever had any trouble with any of the residents here. I didn't really want to do so now either, but after 5 agonizing minutes it was clear this guy was not going to give up hammering on the door. I thought it would be better to talk to this idiot. Before he woke up the whole damn building, I put the chain on the door and slowly opened it. The instant I inched the door open, a knife jutted through the gap. It danced its way toward me. I pushed on the door as hard as I could, and thankfully the owner of the knife seemed to be weaker than me. The door closed shut the whole way, and everything fell silent. I didn't get a good look at the guy's face. I shouted through the door, "Hey, what the fuck was that?" I never got a reply. I just heard someone board the elevator, and it departing. Could it be that someone had mistaken my room for another? Did someone on this floor have a grudge against another person? What kind of grudge provokes a spontaneous knife attack? I thought the residents here were all older anyway. None of this made any sense. Everyone in the building seemed mostly nice, and there had never been any trouble as far as I knew. I just couldn't figure it out. I couldn't do much about it either. I decided I couldn't do anything but get some rest. I had to work the next day anyway. Yes, I know I should have called the police, but I didn't do so. The following night, or if I should more accurately say the following morning, the same thing happened again. The same psycho showed up at my door, knife in hand. I was scared and angry now. The adrenaline was really pumping through me. "What are you doing? You've got the wrong guy. Who does this at this time of night?" I shouted all kinds of stuff, hoping something would make sense to this guy out there. I grabbed a big piece of wood. It was part of a shelf that had recently come down. I was ready to knock some sense into this guy. I was also ready to call the police. I just didn't know which was going to be the most effective first. I decided to take one more look out the peephole. The guy was just kind of standing there in a daze. I got a good chance to look at his face, and that's when I began to recognize him from somewhere. I had only ever bumped into him in the lobby a couple of times. He always made small talk with me and seemed like a really nice older guy. He'd even asked me if I wanted to have dinner with him one of those times. Well, I was really glad I didn't accept that invitation now. I think he lived somewhere below me. I couldn't get my head around this. Why was he now just randomly attacking me? I called the police right away. I kept silent all the while he continued to hammer on my door and try the lock. Anyway, to cut an incredibly frustrating story short, the guy was interviewed by the police when they arrived. I gave my statement, but as far as I can tell, he made it out like he was totally innocent. He pretended he knew nothing about what happened. The cops patronized me and kept asking me if I was under the influence. They warned me not to lie to the cops. Well, I knew what I'd seen. What frightened me the most is that he got away with it so easily. Would he do it again? The police wouldn't do anything about him, I realized. I bumped into him a couple more times before I moved out. He would just smile at me and put his hands in his pockets. I've been struggling to find a reason for his resentment towards me, but I could come up with nothing. Maybe it's because I was young or something. Keep an eye on your neighbors. That old saying, a wolf in sheep's clothing, can really be more true than you realize. When I was a kid between the ages of 14 to 16, me and my friends were really into hanging out anywhere other than our houses. Most of the time, we would go to some fast food place and chill there, or find some spot in the woods near the park. I guess we were at that age where we wanted to be alone and not have people looking over our shoulders all the time. The only problem with this was that on the weekends when we'd be out late, most stores and dining areas closed before we were ready to call it a night. During a winter break one year, we ran into this problem quite a lot. We'd go to the parks to hang out, only to find that even in the late hours of the night, there would be multiple other groups that had the same idea. Then one night, my friend JT brought up his parents' old farmhouse, saying it could be a cool spot to explore, and surely nobody else would be there. He'd mentioned it a few times before this, but we never thought much of it until that night. JT drove me and my other friend Paul out into what looked like the middle of nowhere. We arrived at a wooden fence. The fence was closed off with a chain, since it was private property and JT didn't have the key to it. We parked and hopped over it from the edge of the wooden fence. The first thing I realized was that I couldn't see the farmhouse. Yeah, it was dark out, and there were no lights anywhere, but I couldn't even make out a shape of a house in any direction. JT started walking, leading the way on a rough gravel path. He started to explain why his grandparents even had this place to begin with. He said it was his grandparents' farmhouse, but when they died, they'd passed it down to his parents. Apparently, it was just in really horrible condition, and his parents didn't know what to do with it, so they just kept it that way. That was almost 10 years ago, and nobody had done any maintenance or even checked up on it in over a decade. We walked down this path following JT for a good 10 minutes or so. We finally began to be able to make out a building, or at least the outline of it in the dark. You could tell even from here that it was in really bad shape. The roof was visibly dipping inward, like it was about to collapse at any moment. Some of the siding panels were hanging from the wood. All of us were quiet now, just kind of looking at it as we walked closer. When we got up to the front of the house, the door was covered by a large sheet of wood. We went around to the back, where the door was completely missing altogether. We each turned on our phone flashlights and stepped inside. Surprisingly, the inside wasn't really trashed like we'd thought it would be. Most of the furniture and stuff didn't seem to have been moved very much. It was extremely dusty though. Our phone's lights were not the best, so maybe it looked better than it actually was. We split up, and after a minute of just walking around the first floor, I entered a hallway on the left side of the house. I began walking down that corridor when suddenly someone walked past the end of the hallway. I froze, and out of panic I called out to JT, wondering if maybe it was him wrapping around or something, but I already knew that couldn't be it. The man I saw in the dark was much taller and thinner than either of my friends. I stepped back and started to go to where I'd last seen the two of them. When I turned around the corner and held up my light, both GT and Paul were standing in the middle of the room, looking away from me. I stepped into the room and looked at what their lights were pointing at. At the edge of the light, the man was standing and staring right back at them. It was like they were all frozen in fear, unsure of what to make of the situation. "Guys, let's leave," I said, trying to act as calm as possible so the guy wouldn't do anything. That must have triggered everyone's reaction at once though, because suddenly we were all sprinting to the back door and running out into the open field. With all the scrambling and footsteps, I can't even say for sure if the man chased us out. JT says he was confident he did though. We pretty much ran straight back to the car and drove off, not taking any more risks. I think we can all assume the man was either a squatter or a homeless person, defending the place he'd come to call home, but without a good look at him, it was hard to say for sure. JT said he'd tell his parents about it so they could lock down the farmhouse, but he never really went through with it. He was worried about getting in trouble for going there. What happened that night remains one of the most horrifying experiences I've had, and if JT was right and the man was trying to chase us out, then we were all really lucky to get out of there unharmed. Not more than a week or two ago, I hiked out on a long trail in the dense woods behind my town. I lived in a really close-knit town with just under 1,000 people, so we were pretty far out from any big populated cities. The woods on the outskirts were very flat, no mountains or hills of any sort, but there were a few ponds and some small rivers running through the middle. I was heading out to one of those rivers. I'd been there before a few times, though I'd never had the chance to camp out there. That was until this day. As I could recall from the previous times, I knew it was about a 3-hour walk almost perfectly north. As I walked between the trees, it was very quiet, aside from the birds and other animals rustling the leaves around me. There were no other people or hikers at all, and I didn't plan on seeing anyone either. This was not even a trail, it was just open woodland. As I was about 45 minutes out from the river though, I suddenly stumbled into someone. We were both walking toward each other, and it seemed like neither of us had noticed each other until we were just a few feet away, separated by only a few trees. I know I must have had a confused and almost nervous look. I found it really unusual to run into someone off-trail in the middle of the woods like this. The man had just about the same look. I was about to break the silence and offer a hello, but after a second his face shifted into a nervous smile, and he turned to walk off to the side. I followed his lead and kept walking past, but I looked back once I got a bit further away. I saw the man was no longer walking, but was running away now, not making a single sound. When running into each other, it gave me a somewhat unsettling feeling, but seeing him run off like that only made it even stranger. It was like the man did not want to be seen there. Whatever the case, I decided to mind my own business and continued making my way to the river. This was no campsite or anything, obviously, so I just plopped my bag and tent down on the flattest area I could find. Then I went to get a fire going. Since the sun was just about to set, I tossed in a bunch of random sticks and twigs that were around, and made sure it would burn for a couple of hours at least. I was hoping to stay up and wait until the stars came out, so I could do some stargazing away from town. I could often get a good view of the Milky Way, which was a sight I never wanted to miss out on. Hours passed by while I was sitting and waiting, until a very distinct sound came through the quiet woods behind me. Footsteps, slow and careful ones. I turned and looked, not making out much in the darkness as I gazed around. The footsteps did stop though, telling me that while I may not see them, they could clearly see me. I reached down for my bag and picked up my heavy-duty flashlight, shining it out into the trees. I could see decently far now, but as I moved it back and forth, I didn't see anyone out there. I felt my heart rate increasing a bit as the unsettling feeling came over me again. "Anyone out there?" I waited for a moment with no response, then tried again. "Hello?" Not even the sound of another footstep. After a moment of contemplation, I started to walk toward where I'd heard the sound from. Maybe there was a chance I was mistaken, but I needed to be sure. I carefully stepped out through the woods, keeping my flashlight steadily pointing ahead. I got to where I thought the sound was coming from. I moved the light to my left, looking behind each tree. Needless to say, I was caught by surprise when the light suddenly revealed a large man in hiding. It was the one I'd run into only a few hours ago. He was no more than 20 feet away, but even with the light now on him, he stood perfectly still. In an act of quick thinking, I tried not to react and continued to move my flashlight across the woods, hoping he might think I didn't see him somehow. I then began walking back to the tent, trying to act as unbothered as possible. I picked up my bag and looked around once more, before quickly leaving my tent and campfire behind. I walked into the woods following the river's side. Once I felt I'd made enough distance between us, I started running as far and fast as I could, until I was without a doubt away from that man. I found a spot to rest at with a good view, and sat there wide awake until sunrise. I don't think the man followed me that far, as I was able to make it out without hearing or seeing the man again. I'm not sure why exactly he was out there, or why he showed up and hid by my campsite at night, but I never went back to retrieve my tent, in fear that I might find out if I did so. "2 years ago, I lived with my younger brother on the East Coast. For the most part, though, we didn't really go out much. I mean, we'd hang out with friends a lot and get food or whatever, but we never really went out and did anything interesting. I started to look up things to do, and one of the most common suggestions was to go camping. We were right along the Appalachians, after all. I told my brother, but he didn't seem to be very interested. A couple days later, I went out and bought a few things like a small tent and some safety tools. I packed up one of my old backpacks and drove out to a nearby trail. Yes, I was really inexperienced, and going camping alone was not a good idea, but I'd only planned to be out for one single night. I figured that even if there was a problem, it wouldn't be that bad. After an hour or so of driving, I got to the trail. No other cars were parked there, and I didn't see any other people either. I got out and put on my backpack, then walked over to the trailhead. It was a thin and not really well-made path, but it was good enough for me. I don't think this was really a popular trail. I just found it by randomly scrolling through a huge list and choosing one that wasn't too long. As I hiked down this path, it became more and more clear just how little used this trail was. Bushes were overgrown and blocking the way. In some portions, the grass had even grown over it and made it really hard to tell what was the trail and what wasn't. After an hour, I made it to the end. After seeing the trail, I reached about what I expected the campground to be. It was a small and mostly overgrown space, but there was something I noticed right away. It really caught my attention. There was a pile of logs on the other side of the campground. I walked over to it and saw that charred flakes of wood were blowing off in the wind. It had to have been used very recently, maybe even just the night before. I looked around again, not seeing any tents or signs of anyone else being there. I was unsure about things. I went to the other end and put my things down, then got to work on the tent. It wasn't that late yet, so I took my time to make sure the tent was well made. Once I was done, I took a breather, sitting down and chilling for a minute. There was about an hour left of sunlight. I spent it eating and sitting inside the tent on my sleeping bag. After a while, I could tell the sun was setting. Soon after, a sound came from somewhere nearby, a crackling sound, like from a campfire. I unzipped the opening and stepped out. Immediately, I could see a man sitting across the campsite, right next to where the half-burnt logs were. He was an older man, probably in his late 40s, but there wasn't much else I could see from the little amount of light coming through the trees. He was already looking right at me. I nervously waved my hand at him. The man waited a few seconds, then lifted his hand as well. I went around to the back of my tent and got a pile of sticks, then made a small campfire. It only took a few minutes before it was completely dark out there. The only lights were from our campfires. I kept looking over to see if the man had a tent or a backpack or anything. All I could see was him. Every time I looked, I got more weirded out and uneasy. Where did the man even come from? My tent was set up right next to the trail, so surely I would have heard him walking by. That is, unless he'd come from the other side, which was nothing but empty woods. I sat out there for at least an hour, probably 2. I never saw the man move from his spot. He just sat by the fire with a 1,000-yard stare. Eventually, I went inside my tent, figuring I had to be overthinking all of this. Surely the man was just another camper. He was on a public camping ground after all. I laid down and tried to get some rest, but I don't think my mind would let me sleep. I just stared at the ceiling and listened to the faint crackling of the man's fire. I was in there for another hour or so before I heard leaves slowly crunching. Someone was making their way toward my tent. I sat up and listened more carefully now. I could see the shadow of the man standing on the other side of the fabric. My whole body froze, watching him just stand out there. He didn't move at all, and didn't speak either. Just as suddenly as he'd walked up to me, his shadow started moving away. I heard the leaves crunch into the distance. I quickly unzipped the tent and looked out. The campground was empty. The man was gone, having left only the burning logs as his remnants. I started to pack up, shoving the tent into its holder, and even breaking some of the rods just to move faster. I left without ever seeing the man come back. As for why he was out there, or what he was trying to do, I really don't know. About a year ago, I was living with one of my mates. I stayed in a ground floor flat that kind of sits in a cul-de-sac and is a bit of a pain to walk to. It's kind of detached from the community. The only times I felt completely safe there were during sunlight hours, depending on the time of year, of course. The block of flats is arranged in an L-like shape. Our entrance sits right inside the 90-degree angle. Inside the main building, there's a flat either side and stairs in front. The immediate entrance hall is very dark. I feel like the lights kinda choose when and when not they feel like working sometimes. The flats are all very basic. A hallway, 2 small double bedrooms, a bathroom, a decent living room, and a small kitchen. The hallway itself is quite long, and the living room is right at the end of it. Both bedrooms face each other, so we could talk to each other from within our doorways. If that makes sense. I'm telling you all this to help you picture the incident. It was around 11 o'clock or 11:30 at night perhaps. My flatmate was in her room, presumably asleep. She had this bad habit of leaving things unlocked every now and then. I always have to get up and make sure everything is locked up before I head off to sleep. But she'd gotten better about it, and normally at least had the chain on the door if she'd forgotten the main lock. She always went to bed pretty early, so I didn't really mind having to do this. I was in the living room and decided to grab a pint of water before heading to bed myself. I went into the kitchen, which was attached to the living room. I switched on the kitchen light and filled up a glass. The car park in front of our flat was very dark, and I remember this eerie feeling coming over me. I couldn't quite say why. I just felt like something was really off here, the kind of feeling you get when you switch the light off and feel the need to run up the stairs. Anyway, I took a couple sips and filled the glass a little more, then went to head out of the kitchen. To my surprise, I heard the front doorbell ring. I froze. I didn't even know we had a doorbell. That tells you how many visitors we usually got. About 10 seconds passed before the letterbox was hit twice, and my stomach sank. I felt trapped in the kitchen. Important to note 2 things here. If you step out of the kitchen area, it puts you in perfect line with the hallway if the living room door is open, which it was. And 2, our front door had a bloody window on it, so you could see the silhouettes of anyone outside or in. We did have a cute gray curtain across the front, but it was pretty see-through. I grabbed my phone and called my mate who was in her room, right next to the front door. "Did you hear that?" We were both wondering if we had just imagined it. We had to whisper because the walls were paper thin. You could always hear people coming and going. She crept out to her bedroom doorway, but couldn't go forward because then she'd be in direct sight of the window. I edged my way out of the kitchen, keeping flat against the wall. I sunk down to the floor, texting her now because we were closer to the door. We didn't want whoever was outside to hear us. Another thing you should note is this person must have buzzed other flats to get into the building, because they sure didn't buzz ours. I reckon they must have seen me through the kitchen window. Lying in a kind of army crawl, I could see the silhouette of a tall, bald man. He chapped the letterbox again, but just stood there. Terrified, I mouthed to my mate, "Did you remember to lock the door?" She said no. The chain wasn't on the door either. It was now or never, I supposed. I crawled as low as I could to my bedroom, grabbed my keys, and crawled over to the door. I frantically shoved the keys in and twisted, at the same time putting the chain on. It was a noisy affair, and obviously the man noticed I was there now. As I desperately tried to twist the crappy old-school key into the lock, I finally got it. I was terrified to stand up. My mate poked her head out of her room to see if he wasn't there anymore. She was kind of half-stoned, so she kind of fell asleep and went back to bed. But something was nagging at me, though, really badly. Remember how I said you could easily hear people coming and going? Well, it was really quiet, and not once did either of us hear the building's main door open or close. This was someone who was from our building. We had one person across from us, two people above us, and two above them. Two of those flats were students. Our neighbor was a 98-year-old woman. It was a couple with a short, long-haired and chill guy, so nobody we knew lived there matched the frame of the man in our flat window. I stayed up until I couldn't anymore, keeping my room door shut and keeping my hockey stick next to my bed. I realized about a month after this that the service button to the front main building was broken, and anybody could come right in if they pressed it. If they were very quiet, you wouldn't even know they had slipped inside. I think the person must have saw me in the kitchen in the light and thought to try their luck that night. It easily could have been a different story had I not managed to lock the door in time. Always lock your doors, heck, double lock even, no matter how safe you reckon your area is. We have no idea to this day who that man was, nor why he was there. Obviously, we never saw him again, and we never heard anyone use our doorbell again. A couple of years ago, I went to the Grand Canyon during the summertime. I went there on a road trip with my best friend Amanda. I had never been to the Grand Canyon before, but she had been there once when she was younger. We drove on this one road for a long time that was supposed to lead to the park. Once we entered, we followed another road into one of the main parking lots. I was surprised at just how big the park was. There were various campsites on it, and several trails as well. When we got there were quite a few other people. We went down one trail to see the actual canyon. There are several walking trails alongside it, and many different lookout areas as well. We walked along it and stopped at several of those lookout spots, many of which were pretty crowded. At probably the second or third one we stopped at, I got approached by this random guy. He was a man that was sort of big with dark hair. He said hello to me and told me his name was Joe. He then asked me if me and Amanda would be interested in going on a tour and said that he led a guided tour around these parts. I wasn't too interested myself, so I said no thanks. He then asked me again if I was sure, and I said yes once more. After that, he just walked away. We took a bunch of pictures and stuff and moved along. About 15 minutes later, I would say, we were at another overlook area. There were other people there as well, but not nearly quite as many as before. I noticed that same guy, Joe. He was walking over and approached us again. This time, he said he'd forgotten to mention that the tour was free because somebody else had apparently canceled. He asked once more if we wanted to go. I thought about it for a second, but I still didn't want to go with this random guy. I said no to him. He asked if we were sure again, and we both said yes. He walked away just like before. This whole thing seemed a little bit strange, especially because he didn't bother to ask anybody else. He just asked us and then walked away. Amanda and I stayed at the lookout spot for a couple more minutes after that. We kept walking along the canyon and looking out at different viewpoints. I remember that sometime later, we stopped at another spot and saw Joe yet again, a little ways away. I was afraid he was going to approach us once more, but he didn't do so. He was with another guy, and they were just kind of standing around acting shady. Amanda and I walked in a different direction. There were a few paths that went through some nearby areas, and not as many people were on these ones. We walked down a couple of them. I remember that about halfway down one of them, I saw Joe again. He was walking a ways behind us, and that's when I started to get really weirded out by him. It still didn't seem like a huge deal. There were still some other people around, and the paths were not super avoided or anything. We later went back to the canyon again, and didn't see him. We finished up at the gift shop, and each of us got some souvenirs. Out of nowhere, guess who I noticed again? There was Joe. He was with his friend from earlier. He didn't try to approach us, but it was a strange coincidence seeing him everywhere we'd gone throughout the entire day. Whatever tours they were supposed to be giving, they were apparently not doing so. By the time we got our souvenirs, it was starting to get late out. The sun was setting and we decided to drive back. Our hotel was over an hour away. We went back to my car and what I assume is the main parking lot. As we were getting in and preparing to leave, I saw the two guys once again. They were a long ways away and just entering the lot. I kept an eye on them because I was very suspicious at this point. I noticed them begin observing us. They went over to an old SUV, which was parked on the other side of the lot. Is that what they were supposed to be giving tours in? I wasn't really buying the whole tour story at all. I was feeling really glad we hadn't said yes to them. We got inside my car and started to leave. As we were driving down the road, though, the SUV the guys were driving followed in right behind us. If my memory is correct, there's really just one main highway that leads to and from the Grand Canyon. There isn't a whole lot on it for like an hour either, though. Just outside the park area, there are a few restaurants and gas stations, so we decided to stop and grab some gas. My car's tank was a little low, and we didn't know where the next opportunity to fill up would be. We didn't know if the guys would continue to follow us either. As we pulled into the gas station, they pulled in right behind us. Now we were really concerned. I started filling my car with gas, and the SUV parked in a spot on the side. Nobody attempted to get out and refuel or anything. I finished up. Amanda and I decided to go inside the store. The gas station was pretty large inside. We were browsing around through some stuff to idle time when we noticed the same two men sneaking inside. We tried to avoid them, and they didn't seem to be trying to approach us or anything, but I knew this wasn't a coincidence. We got a few things and left the store. As we left, we noticed the guys immediately leaving right behind us. We hurried and jumped into the car. The guys went back to their SUV. As I left, unfortunately, they followed right after us. We both went onto the main highway leaving the Grand Canyon. There weren't really any exits, but I tried slowing down, speeding up, changing lanes. Whatever I did, the SUV remained right behind us. We were thinking of what to do. After a while, we got the idea to drive to a police station directly. Unfortunately, there was not one for a while. Over the next few minutes, things remained the same. We drove with them following us until we were finally off the highway. We then headed to the nearest police station. Luckily, the SUV did not attempt to follow us into the station itself. After that, we reported what happened. We gave a description of the guys. However, we did not get their license plate number. After that, we made it back to our hotel just fine. I'm really glad we got away from those guys. Who knows what they were planning? I live in a really small countryside town. The population's only a few thousand, and the nearest city is a couple hours away. Most of the people that live here are quite close. With there being so few people around, everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew everything that was going on in town as well. At the time, I was in high school and had a best friend named Chris that I'd hang out with pretty much every day. During mid-fall, there was a lot of talk about this empty farmhouse in the town that people were keen on exploring. I was never one to do those sorts of things, but Chris was, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't the least bit curious. Supposedly, this farmhouse had been left behind by the owners years ago. Left to rot on the edge of town for the past 5 years. Being in high school, the rumors of it spread like wildfire. People were telling stories about it, daring others to explore it. It was on one weekend night that Chris brought it up to me as well. We had nothing else to do really, and Chris seemed really excited to see what everyone was talking about. After finding a couple flashlights, we got in the car and drove to the farmhouse. We only knew which road it was on, but it wasn't very hard to find from the road. You could see the rotting house in the distance. We couldn't find the driveway up to it though. It was likely it had long since been overgrown, might not even exist anymore. We parked on the road and started walking through the field towards this house. It was almost 1 a.m., so the moon was lighting up the field just enough for us to navigate through. As we got closer, it almost felt like the night got quieter and quieter around us until we reached its area. The house had weeds infesting the whole yard, and vines growing through the wooden panels on the outside. Chris led the way, walking around to the front where the door was missing. That gave us easy enough access inside. We stepped in and started walking through the rooms, looking at the trash on the ground and the decaying interior. It made both of us wonder why it had been abandoned to begin with. After a minute or two, though, we'd seen everything on the first floor. We moved up to the second. It was much darker upstairs. There were no windows to let in the moonlight. We both turned on our flashlights and shined them around. There were only 2 rooms up there, one on the left side of the hallway and the other on the right side. Chris went up to the left, finding that the door was locked. While he was struggling with that door, I went over to the other room. It happened to be unlocked. It was entirely empty, having mold covering the ceiling, and nothing more. There was a single window with slabs of wood nailed across it. Curious, I went up to it. Why would they need to block an upstairs window? I crouched down to investigate, and looked in between the 2 slabs to see what was outside. Maybe it had access to the roof or something. It didn't, though. This was just an ordinary window facing the field we'd come from. As I looked out into the moonlit grass, I saw a figure walking toward the farmhouse, not too far away. I left the window and whispered to Chris that someone was coming. My heartbeat was already speeding up. I think it was seeing the figure being all alone that really freaked me out, though. Knowing this was not another group of kids just exploring this place. Chris looked nervous too. He walked over to the window to see for himself, but we immediately stopped at the sound of footsteps entering the house downstairs. We froze in place, standing in the middle of the empty room, too scared to even take a step and risk being found. The person walked slowly through the first floor, going to the stairs and beginning to walk up. Both Chris and I stared at the open doorway, listening as the footsteps approached the top. They started coming even closer, until the large figure of a man appeared in front of us. He was facing the other way, unlocking the locked door. As he stood in that dark hallway just 4 or 5 feet away from us, I held my breath in my hands, hoping he would not turn around. When he opened the door, I immediately locked eyes with another man who had been waiting inside that room. Our gaze was broken as the man went into the room and closed the door behind him. We heard them whispering immediately after. Chris and I made our move, sprinting into the hallway and down the stairs. We heard the door swing open and footsteps charging out behind us. We fled the house and ran for the field. We didn't stop until we got to the car, driving away as fast as we could. The whole ride back to my house, neither of us said a single word. We were both just in shock, taking everything in. We had no idea what was going on in that house or who those men were, but out of fear of getting in trouble for trespassing, we did not call the police. We were stupid to have even gone there in the first place. I won't defend any of my actions, but I feel like there was something more sinister going on at that farmhouse. A month after that incident, the house was bought and torn down with no reason given. Whether or not something was really going on in there, we'll never be able to find out now, that's for sure.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and that little notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you have your own encounter you'd like to share, leave a comment below. Who knows, it might just find its way into a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the scariest stories are often the ones closest to home.